Some notes on the so-called Europeanish Wissenschaft, or the European science. Now, generally, we don't talk about science as being qualified in that sense, and being European science, or somebody, paleo-conservative type, told me that Nazis use the term Jewish physics. But what's the point of these adjectival sort of observations about the nature of a given science? A certain culture produced what we now call the modern sciences in the Spenglerian version, a sort of northern European culture, and everything corresponding to what we call what we call Aufklärung, Luminaires, Hochsala, or rational enlightenment, inclusive both of the people like Francis Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, Boyle on the one side, and people like Voltaire, and earlier Montaigne, and the encyclopedists and the so-called philosophers on the other side. Somehow this rationalism and scientific experiment have a specific origin with the Europeans, and culminating, according to Husserl's version, or not culminating so much, but having it sort of fons et arrigo, or sort of continuing, or its origin and its continuing source from especially Galileo, and then in Kant from the philosophy of Überhaupt, or generalization. In a certain sense, the critical philosophy gives way to the interpretation of Kant as the philosophy of generalization, or put another way, routinization, routinization, so that everything, for instance, notoriously charisma, which was just a specific characteristic of the Christian Savior and Christian God, becomes a routine designation of leaders, of a leader type, according to Weber. So there's a science is this way of doing generalized analysis with rote categories, which ignore all Ereignis or eventing, or all genuine singular events, as in the some interpretations of the Kurzweil interpretation of accelerationism, for instance. So the vision in Spengler of the end of history coincides with that. What we have is one specific culture produces science, but then the whole Earth, everyone on Earth, including Dugin's Russia, though the old believers would probably exclude it if they could, but I don't think Dugin is in keeping with the old believers. He says he's in keeping with the Orthodox Church, which are much less, they don't forbid drinking coffee, for instance, as I think the old believers do. One specific culture produces a practice, so-called modern science, experimental science, which then opens up to everyone, all the other cultures on Earth, and starts to take over all the other cultures on Earth. So at length, this seems to be the decisive respect, although many others think it's some form of economy or some form of so-called ideology. But the technological essence is somehow open to all, rages over the earth. So you got one, in effect, the ultimate culture is that culture which, through domination of the earth, through being open, through opening itself in such a way that it flows into all the other parts of the earth, then this rationalized culture that takes sort of, it's pictured by Weber especially, but Weber who sees it in the light of Nietzsche's analysis, early reader of Nietzsche, as this, what at first gets denounced before Weber's time as the bureaucracy rather than democracy or aristocracy. Remembering that at the time of the French Revolution, aristocracy lost its old meaning of being the best, ruled by the best, and became the meaning of ruled by parasites. I mean, you could look at that in the OED and see how the English usage kind of changes with these events. So that you get bureaucracy, and then at length, I think, currently when we talk about technocrats, which for some, as in Indian newspapers, technocrat tends to be positive. It tends to be depreciatory in American political usage to some extent. I don't know, the guy who was sort of a Trump supporter, who hasn't been mentioned that much, that I forget his name. So I think with the Indian background of some kind, Hindu background of some kind, presented himself as something as a technocrat, because technocrats and sort of tech oligarchs sort of merge in some way as people claiming to have skill in engineering rather than in the confusion of ideology and the humanities. This type of, so that's an example of where the sciences also become a form of government, and not only, as it were, a form of the general culture. How so far India has been able to absorb these new changes and remain Hindu is a big question. How so far China has negotiated its existence and become totally scientific, almost to the total expense of its long history, is another question. I mean, communism being in itself supposed to be a technocratic. It's supposed to be an attempt to take this situation where the world culture, or the so-called universal culture, has come in, and then negotiated an existence of it in the way most beneficial to the to human beings. And so it's just sort of like going faster ahead of the Catholics, who also basically accept science, modern science. I mean, de facto they do, even if in their metaphysics they differ with whatever the latest theory of the physicist is, which then put their sort of, I mean, the changing ontological commitments of a physicist, then, as we see with Zizek's constant engagements with questions of physics, they change how the results of experiments are then to be understood. So I mean, the overall thrust of it is the idea of the end of history is not just the idea that one culture among the West has come to the end, but it's rather also that this culture, the West, has literally de facto taken over everywhere, and therefore, when Heidegger talks about the negotiation with the technological essence, it implies also this problem where you don't know, in terms of this closeness and remoteness problem, where you stand, because anywhere on Earth there's these features of the supposed last culture, which is in a certain way no longer a culture, are visible. And all this we should remember. One, it's accepted by every anthropology department that there's, so far as I know, that we should think of things in terms of difference rather than hierarchy, but at the same time it's accepted that this version of difference rather than hierarchy is superior and, as it were, belongs to the hermeneutic situation beyond the sort of last culture in the accelerationist culture, which is a global culture. So this has to some extent an inescapable trajectory to it, and then Heidegger says you have to negotiate an existence with that, which I think in some way Dugin is trying to do. But a lot of interesting. I think it's just helpful to see that this the notion of culture is relatively new as the largest, instead of state talking about culture as the largest sphere of things, but then noticing that if culture means the material and proficiencies of a certain people, then science coming from only one certain people has taken over the earth, and therefore the earth is a world European culture to some extent, to the extent that in the most extreme sense, that the Hindus can either absorb it or they can become merged with it.